Katrina, if you wouldn't mind translating for me.
Okay.
I should have done this on the first day, but we were very busy trying to get the Zoom organized, so it didn't happen. But I really want to welcome Geshe-la to the Abbey and to thank him once again for teaching us. It's been over 7 years that he's taught us every year, and it's really been quite wonderful. And we're extremely grateful for arranging to do the teachings, especially with the time gap and everything.
No. Ani Geshe-la, ani children, ni kirangla samji tashidale shugiores. Ani tuche na sungja nayala. Ani lota reshin lo dingi ringla kirang ani gumbala sungja nangson ani pe gabo chung song kirang sungja nayala. No, this sabo koma songonda.
Oh, tanda Sravasti, Abbey Kumbayarva.
No.
Kumbaya today Sutu. Ini Kibima, Kilo Masavarva, Kilo Mama Butso. Oh, today Situ Badishida, Bay Abure, Tito Lamarandi, Nanguchi Mutuche, Kukaptoba de Kawi, Jesuira, yes.
So Geshe-la would just also like to say that he is very grateful that this opportunity has arisen to teach those of you at the Abbey who are interested in learning. This is a very fortunate opportunity, and he rejoices in all of the study that you're doing.
Yeah, we are doing our best to try and refresh what he teaches us each year, but it's good that he keeps teaching us because it all doesn't stick in our mind.
Yangyar lobjong chegorwa. Ta kirang ngama sunya di yangyar di lobjong chea tapche chegiore ani kirang mutu ne sungja nangyala pe gabo chungsong.
Oh, yeah. What did you say?
Thank you.
And then I also want to welcome everybody who is listening in. I saw the list of people who registered. I saw several old friends who I haven't seen in long time. So I'm very happy that you're all joining in with the teachings. Thank you. And thank you, Katrina, for translating. Okay.
So welcome to all who are participating and who are joining us today. And I would like to remind you about the prayers that we do at the beginning and at the end of the class. You can find those on the Abbey's homepage under Guide to Abbey Online Programs. There's also other pertinent information there that could be useful to you. So at the end of each session, Geshe Thabkhe will make a space for questions. So if you have a question about the material covered in class, please make sure to cite the relevant page number and verse number from the text to help Katrina quickly find the reference. Write your questions on the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're watching on YouTube, send your questions to office.sravasti@gmail.com and write question for Geshe Thabkhe on the subject line. We have a limited Q&A time each day and request your patience and understanding if your question is not asked in class. If for any reason your question is not answered, keep it in your notes and continue attending teachings and retreats. We're sure it will eventually be answered. Thank you, and we can now proceed to the prayers.
To the teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one God to bliss, knower of the world, supreme God of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, you, the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I'm supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain. Fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, supreme God, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great, compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, free from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom, too well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from flowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Disong.
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's it. Chipsonga watching this over the law. Oh, to the Gasha. To me, Nimi Samla Mambenas. To me, Tembating, Nimi, to me, Sambala Deba Mashana Sugara. To me, Nimi Samla Mambena. And the Tarba to Nishimi dishes. Qualia, to me, Tembalia. Canton, to me, the Yabos in Masana. And the Tarba to Nijoloki Marwa. Or Tarba to Nishimi dishes. When you miss on the Mambena, Tarba to Nishimi. Kunjo Koya Jurim Masam Nasogua, Kunjo Demba to make you, Kunjo Demba to make you Karimba, Any Yamoda, Nemo, the Sakale, but Tome Maribakuna, Nibantu Sadi. To make the church of that, some Matana Sugura. Kunju Kore, Juri Masana, Jubber, Batango, Tome Maribaki, Lesa, Subanam Shele Sasha, Yavaseva, the Kuba, the sort of condition, Yolandiora, all the Kunju, Lesa, the Kuala, Kedaki, Yavumasa, Sugura, Kunju Kore, Juri Masanas. And then Kore Sawa Chuju Mishima, Kwa. Sawati mercy and the Korean Jewish Sawa mercy, Jipa never so at the Hakuma lesson. Oh, yeah, this is the Korean Sawa Chuju. Sealing in Joshet Tembanas, Siba Koalia, Tumedi Samne, Telejoy Buddhist, Transit Joy, Nevanchum Buddhist, Sealing in Joshet Tembat, Koal Kangi Chimba Sheba says. Qualia, Shinji, you got there. Tim Hunting, but she Sheba said, Geshe Oh, yeah.
So then as for what to begin with today, as J. Lama Tsongkhapa says, if you make no effort to ponder the faults of true suffering, a genuine wish for liberation will not arise. If you do not contemplate how the origin of suffering leads to samsara, you will not know how to eliminate the root of samsara. Hence, it is essential to cultivate renunciation of samsara and recognize what binds you in samsara. So here, as it says in this verse, if you don't make any kind of effort to ponder the faults of suffering, of true suffering, and recognize our situation in samsara for what it is, then you won't give rise to a genuine wish for liberation. You won't be able to generate that desire to be freed from it. And if you don't, in turn, contemplate how the origin of suffering leads us into cyclic existence, then you don't know how to eliminate the root. So you need to contemplate how it is that our ignorance, this fundamental ignorance, leads us to create karma, which in turn lays down imprints on our consciousness, which are fostered by our craving and grasping, leading us into another rebirth. So if you don't understand that kind of process, you won't know how to eliminate its root, to get rid of the root of samsara. So therefore, we need to see the kind of faults of suffering and in order to cultivate this kind of renunciation or disillusionment, revulsion with samsara. And then by recognizing what it is that binds you in samsara, you're able to make an effort at eliminating that cause.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that to me, Mambush was a Lamri to Zalias and Namdu, Lamri Abusendi or it is the same, and then Koyatun Yabu Samluta, and then Yawayita turned to Samlutangura. Oh, T. Yawasaki Shanda, Demotage, so the Tenders and the Mara. So Yawayita turned to Yorba, turned to Mazatoda to me good. So the Chava in Asa, Rani Tendesi Jalambayina, and it to me the Yongo Sunday. The Samutangura, Tenitosko, so Nuga, not to the making of Shago some Hora. But to them, so there's a consul to me in the Yore, some Sosoke, Tabari Shimiche, some corner, Hambasio Mara. How come do Rani High Moli, I take it off. Tinashing Arazo, Yawalikena, Tended to my younger Idalikena, Tendulikena, to make the younger son. And Milikena, Jagana sit to me, Macha, or Tinashing. To me, Kyawa Sambuda and Mabusa, Kesa Yore, Kyawa Mamba to the Kia, your Chipata Tigra, Kotelikena, Niagara, the Shina Marwa, or Telekia Yore Dasa. Came I get the social by your social telemedia, Judy Masana, Jigmara, social television, Judy Sana, Jigara, Sako Kawaki, Makide, social Tanda, Tunda, social and Awanduga. Oh, Tindesan, yeah.
So here we need to contemplate suffering. Now, suffering, as most of us are aware, is described in many different kinds of suffering, or described within the Lam Rim literature. So we probably know from there or other sources these various types of the sufferings of samsara and the sufferings of the individual realms and so forth. But this is something that we need to contemplate in such a way as to see how it applies to ourself. If we're sort of looking over there at other beings, like, oh yeah, those are the sufferings of the hell beings, and those are the sufferings of animals, and we see it as something that's happening to another being, that's not going to elicit the kind of fear of that suffering that is necessary to generate renunciation. So we shouldn't look at it as being just something that's happening to other beings, but really recognize, if I were to be born as that kind of being, I would experience those sufferings. So if I were born in a hell realm, I would have to experience those sufferings, or if I were born as an animal. And so we know the sufferings of being a human. We experience birth, aging, sickness, and death. But we should also contemplate what it would really be like if we were, say, to be born as a god. What would our sufferings be? Or if we were born in a hell realm, what would our sufferings be? If we have that kind of fear, then we recognize, well, whether or not we are born in those kinds of realms is up to us. It's in our hands. Right now, we have the autonomy, the independence to be able to make the decision about where we will go through the kind of causes that we create.
Oh yeah. Oh, the casa to me, Chidiabo Samrutan. Then it Judy Carres and Social Samrutane. Oh, Tome Mariba. Na Samsanga Rao Anje. Tewangi Chagaki. Tewangi any less of Dua. Sunam Gilese. Sunam Maimbeles. Miu and less, let Sumi Gudua. Sunam Maimbe Sana. Tibasana. And then you are that temple Yora. Sunam Gile de Sasona, Debe Mida Halaki Yora. Miwa Lesigua, Miwa Leside, Sunday to the Sumit to the Kyola to the Tingin Kongora. Oh, Italia, Miwa Lesigua. Shenda Pasuma, the social Kawaki and Tingin Company and Telekigura. Oh, Tindiko Kunjungi, Jungrimdi, Simbache, Koyazawadi.
So upon contemplating suffering, thinking about the various kinds of suffering, you then think about, well, what is the cause of this suffering? Where does this originate? So we first have this strong kind of grasping at an I, apprehension of an I, and based upon that, we give rise to attachment and aversion, desire and hatred. And based upon that, we then engage or accumulate various karmas or actions, meritorious, non-meritorious, or what's called unmoving. So if we accumulate kind of non-meritorious actions, we're creating the causes for a bad rebirth, to be born in a hell realm. Whereas if we are creating meritorious causes, we are creating the kind of causes that will lead to a good rebirth as a human or a god. And this kind of unmoving causes are created through the development of meditative stabilization. So these are the kinds of causes, karmas, that lead to rebirth in the meditative concentrations and come about from cultivating that kind of meditative stabilization. So from recognizing this process, we see how it is that this fundamental ignorance drives us to, through attachment and aversion, then create karma and continue in this cycle.
Oh yeah, they go Kasura. Tatanazo Militop de Yoride, Joazi Jurva, Yawa Ida, Tendo, Me, Lazama, Tezo Rang, Rankesade, Dosade, Rana Wame to Chene, Kichin, City, Teleke, Yanshi, Teneke, Drogara, Sandoari to the Telekena, and then you will Telekena and Telekena Samutangura. Dear, under Milimato, Yawa Ida, Tendo, Tame Kesara. Take your Toma Mevanera. Toma Mevane, Tanda Dus Devena, go Tata Meva, Tanda Terra. Or Tida Samutana, Samiko Kias Yora. Social around there, let the Nimugasha the Jur. Me Pungurisla, Yanti Ram Megador, Yakawakawaki to an attended Yomara. Or today, Toma Mevane, Tomina, Doadi to Lake. Mahobana, Tanda Nashitana, Tameva. O Tendetsu Samutana, some Georgia Yora. 원래 지타를 주는 타바 책으로 삼로 코레 요아도 어디 근데 삼로 땅고 송도 시계가 나야 동해 가서 될 타세 동해 나다나로 배송에만에 저다다 나오고 삼로다나 타매로 냥고 요아라 동해 가서 될 타 남바 군도 예매 나세 타매로 냥마 야산나 마스나 단다 라게 배즈 마세네 투스테라 동해 가서 될 타 남바 군도 예매 지금 내내 증발라서 집에서서 저 삼로 땅에 동게 송도라 코알라 코네 도와드리는 도만대바나 단다 마우바나 투스테를 하신거라 지금 되는 증발라 같이 집에 지내 게임이 줄사 근데 삼로다는 집에 코에 동네기 집에 지내 게임이 줄때 껴샤고를 송도 어야
No. So right now, we have a human rebirth out of all of the various types of realms in which we could be born, out of hell beings and hungry ghosts and animals, humans, demigods, and gods. Right now, we have this human rebirth. But we have been taking rebirth since beginningless time. So we have been cycling throughout these various realms. We've taken births in all of the various realms. So since our lives are beginningless, we have been taking beginningless rebirths. And right now, in this moment, we have this kind of human life. But if we are to again lose the kind of independence that we have now, we're going to have to cast off this life and go into another. If we lose that kind of autonomy, we're going to have to continue. We don't know where we're going to be born in the future, and continue to endlessly experience this cycle of rebirth without any kind of control. And so thinking about this, looking at how we have beginninglessly been cycling in samsara, and if we don't change things, we will continue endlessly to cycle, we should have a kind of revulsion that arises at that thought, a sense of disillusionment and wanting to be freed from that. So as Aryadeva explains, there's a verse in which he says that this ocean of suffering, this great ocean of suffering is endless, is limitless. And so as long as we are still bound by these causes, we are going to continue to cycle in this limitless kind of cycle. And so contemplating that, how could one not be afraid, not want to get out of that?
Oh yeah, no, that also 동해에 나주 람리나시 나서 삼로다 테니 동해 주티레삼 난진다 차단데 왕게 레사바데레삼 델레라니 타바치고 삼 타바테니 lokke 쩨마마이 마마지나 쩨네바 야네 양도 쩨 바루실은 가게 쩨고라 라니 또 거에 동해에 타바차 아치고 거에 동해에 타바sam게 예소베 심제 상마탐제가 거기서 뭐예 아마집에 내가 야나미 김자도 집에 내가 개마인데 내가 탐제도 심제 신지를 때내라니 초보여도 어디도 심제 탐제 아니 주시고에 마다 란다다와 대화들을 통해 meditative 바냐바인데 탐제 통해서 제 통비에게 기부 산제지 고가 교육세 연대군데 랑도지 내 탐제 개개에게 가사 탈신의 가사신 유아샤미에서 대세도 안에 때 주지리 다르다 탐색해봐 주지리 최년의 예상 끊어서 때문에 삼바수세
So by thinking about suffering, contemplating suffering as we've learned about it from the Lam Rim and so forth in relation to our own experience, and also then contemplating the root of our suffering, our cycling in samsara being due to our grasping at an I, and then the attachment that an aversion that cause us to create karma, and in turn continue to take rebirth. So upon contemplating that, we should give rise to a thought of wanting to get out of this cycle. And at first, we are going to be making this as kind of a contrived or a fabricated mind. We have to sort of make effort at it until it is something that is spontaneous and uncontrived. And then based upon that kind of thinking of wanting to get out, we recognize that it's not just me that is stuck in this cycle of samsara, but all of my friends and family, my mothers and fathers too, are cycling in existence. And we are all, my own existence is actually dependent upon these others. So recognizing both the kindness of other sentient beings as well as our equality in terms of we all are the same in not wanting suffering and wanting wanting to have happiness, we then generate this wish to be able to benefit these other sentient beings most fully by attaining a state of perfect, complete Buddhahood, in which we have eliminated all faults and gained all good qualities, and are able to, based upon our knowledge of what is to be adopted and abandoned, teach that to others. And so we should set this kind of a motivation for listening to the Dharma, thinking that I want to be able to attain such a state for the benefit of all mother sentient beings.
Oh yeah, the showdown. She got to do the thing, but oh, take a day is the name. Oh, that day. Do tambour to me, La.
Drosa swen, kalte.
Oh, Gada to do the thing. Young down to work a day, do tambour sing a demare.
Timarabe, once Kesa the Shokchang Shikya Chukchu Regula, the
Oh yeah.
Dedang Gawa Dembe number Chutru. These some re some idus.
Oh yeah. Oh, they live so I heard this shot. Don't do shit out there.
No.
You got dead on Gawa, but you do more so hard.
No.
Dire
nge consola keta chigienta. As for where we're just trying to make sure we have the right spot where we had left off. So I thought it was identifying the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths that contradict those. Is on 344. If someone from Sravasti has a...
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, direshage. Nipa, detang gawa dembe number chudrup nguzunga. Dine.
Oh yeah.
No.
No. Nipa detang gawa lokshu chudu de shesarva.
De.
Tunge tembashi lokshu shi chudu shesara. That detang gawa dembe number chudu de shegdoa.
No.
Oh, Nipa detang gawa number chudu nguzunga. Tunge chujense. Tunge chujesene degree, Sakja Yele Pumbu chujesene degree.
No.
Oh, Midaba Yende, Rangachi Sigua, Midaba Rese, Midabatia, Kichi Conjuado Genge. Ra Kutan Kengi Kiri Yusa, Narazo Middle China Social Sobode, Kichi Juadu Viora, Semi Kichi Juadu Viora, Sobo Kichi Juadu Viora. Longo Guto, Kalasago, Chuto Guto, Kangachite. Kokeji Jodo Yoda, or the Medaba, Tamusam Tangura, Ragwe Medaba, Tawe Medaba, Yungudoa. Oh, Medaba in the Rangaki, Kabri Mekia, Hindu, Kudan Kenji, touch you. Kudan King, Kudan King, Jurewang, Kidusako, Kujin, Tenekoya, Rangimo, Tu Jeteku, Yutuko, Kujin Kitchen. Ranking on never circle or a kill order. This on the okay, Masa. No, teacher. Rangachi Veshe. Tunyawa in this, that's such a Yelene Pumbungata with the Tunyawa Desa. To make and get to make them big situation. In the language Shawaja in Besha. Let a Yomo Beshawaja. Tommy Maribakunas, Chagda, Shawa the Kura, and Lessa. The Kiddy Lessa Veshawan, the Kunik Yalan she would to do Yongorea. But they call it a Yomo Beshawaja. Tunyawa in the language Shawaja, so around came into a social less Shabati, Shawan the Kunik Kawaka, Kidu, Karim Yonjoy, Hakuyamendua. What they language Shawaja in bitches. Then don't buy in this. Something in Lady Pombo, don't buy in there. One Joab taught to shame medicine. Don't buy in this, a tongue around something in Lady Pombo did on the yard. And then Nas and Gage, one June Gange, can socially lost over some tongue door. Oh, Titty Yoma Resura. Don't buy in this, such a Lady Pombo Nalia, one June Gange, a Chamber, Shandashi taught Yoma Resura. They don't buy this. Don't buy in this. One Joab taught to shame medicine. Tiyena Pungula Wangju Chingenge, Ta Tension, Sogo Pasha, Sim Pasha, Tua Pasha, Luda Simlem also, Ta Round the Chico, the Tio Maresicatoa. Wangju Rabi, Ta Tension may be essential. Ta Meba in this, Rawe Tagi, Mormatus, Sajay Nilly Pumbuto, Rawe Tagi, Mormatusa, Ta Meba Sector. Oh, yeah.
So here then, beginning with identifying the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths that contradict those. So yesterday we had gone through the kind of 16 distorted ideas, excuse me. And then here we turn to the kinds of right ideas that contradict those. So it begins with the suffering of suffering is, and we could also say the suffering of the contaminated aggregates, or the suffering of the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence is. That could be the subject of all of the following. And this is impermanent. So let's take the contaminated aggregates, are impermanent because it occurs occasionally. So our suffering is such that it comes from causes and conditions. It comes up occasionally. And actually, there is a more subtle level of impermanence in that everything is momentary, changing moment to moment, disintegrating moment to moment. So our body and our mind, our life, are things that are changing constantly. We have to eat and we have to drink and we have to take care all of the time. But there's even more subtle than that, this momentariness that pervades all of the truth of suffering. And so because suffering is occasional, or it comes about occasionally, then it definitely has causes and conditions. It's based upon causes and conditions. It's not something whose nature is just abiding, but rather it comes about due to those causes and conditions. And the suffering of the condition, or we can just say the contaminated aggregates, are suffering because they are dependent on karma and defilement. So this contaminated aggregates that we have are the basis of our suffering, because we are driven by ignorance since beginningless time, and all of the afflictions, attachment, and aversion lead us to then engage in virtues and non-virtues and so forth that propel us to take up such aggregates that are the basis of our suffering. And then it is void or empty because there is no objectively separate self that controls it. So we might have a sense of this self that is somehow separate, apart from controlling the aggregates. But if we look within the aggregates, if we separate out each of our aggregates, the form and our feeling and consciousness and so forth, and look for something separate from that that is such a self, it can't be found. So if we put aside all of the aggregates, there's nothing that you could point to as an objectively separate self that is somehow in control. So therefore they are void or empty. And then they are without self because suffering, or these contaminated aggregates, do not exist in the nature of an independent self. So there's no something within those 5 aggregates that we could point to as having a kind of independence or being an autonomous self.
Oh yeah.
No. No. So here then, in terms of these last two components, so the selflessness or being without self, this is referring to, again, a sense of that the contaminated aggregates are empty of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. We're not speaking from the Madhyamaka perspective here. This is a more coarse kind of selflessness. But here, these two final reasons, we could put them as reasons to prove the thesis. So if you have as the subject these contaminated aggregates, they are empty of having or being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And then the two of these would be used as the reasons, because there is no objectively separate self that controls it. So there isn't something apart from or different from the five aggregates that is somehow a self controlling those aggregates. And it is without self because it does not exist in the nature of an independent self. So there is no somehow autonomous or independent self that is the same as the five aggregates. So we could look at it as a syllogism saying the contaminated aggregates are empty of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self because they are not separate from the aggregates nor one with the aggregates.
Oh yeah, what did you get it done? Oh, that and that go. Tango and the Kasi Love Nation, such a Yelly Pongo Mita, but that don't know what the Samlutayate, Tambu de Roa. Kiss Samlutan, Ponga Tami Yibude, Lamji number to me, Juka, Samlutan, Queen Juja. I Judy, Tommy Mariba, Mera Soyag, Lamde Kare, Tami to Lam Kongora. Ponga Tami. Tami to be shared some time, one and some time, Yamdo time, Mara. Don't to me, our cosmetic, you got some chantic, conjuration, and then Boba Toya Yoris, and it get to the Tabka Lam dress, don't damage you corner and get to the Chay Tami to Combu. What is
no. So here, then when it comes to contemplating these aspects of suffering, the thought of sufferings being impermanent and suffering are the contemplations that we initially focus on at the time of really first beginning to think about suffering. And then having that thought, understanding their nature as being impermanent and suffering, one thinks about the kind of origin of that suffering. And so one analyzes what are the causes that lead to such suffering. And it is then upon recognizing that there is a cessation to that suffering and paths that lead to that, that one contemplates these topics of being empty and selfless. So it is in this way, the sort of contemplation on the topics, the third and fourth aspects of the truth of suffering really come later at the time of the path when one is contemplating, well, what is it that is the antidote to this ignorance and what is selflessness and so forth.
Oh yeah. Tanyaba Kunjung number names, Kunjung Tempa led and Yomba Yibutimba. Oh, T number the Shagua, T and to Samutaya Comic to that Shagua. Kunjung number Savada said led Seba Shajan Shagua.
No.
Sabas to Yomo, Yomo, Tanzi del Kosora. Sagwada Chebas to Sawan Yomo, Tatum Zimbe, Jucheba Tenishoe, led Ansigura. Le Kangati Koya Pinchik Le Marwa, Pagwe Kansa to Le Soya to Sagwada Chebe, Tanzingi Kunelane, something Tanzin Kunela, Tewange Rala Chani, I would say the matter to me, Yungre, San Kule, Sambusana, Sachi Le Rigora. Yomogi Duche, Saganda Tanzin Duche and Sagiza Kivele Nako, Sachi Le Kawarwa, Teletene, Tadamida, Tingi Kombayinako. Kewadaya, Koyana actually do Yoda. No, this one. Sabata Jebe Leda, Seba Chujase, Seba Situza Lesa and Ledelaco, Kinch and a certain gig Seba Yora, Seba, and the Keba Seba, Kubalemba Sigua, what did it? Well, Hagardo, Penanga Chicala Mudachina, or Tanga, never they do some chigu, Kubanawar of Shache. Chala Nachi Chinjari Chunatati de Masutite, some Kura, Kevas, Lemba, so yang yachi me toya da amjo koya da chi tende yogo samsara sambuchi ngudwa o de se pasigora kenche lele so tambe ti ke chambure dora ti se pasigora sabada chebe se pasigora gyui namba yinde se tunge temba ke gyu tunge yonje ke gyui namba yinde se gyui yinde se gora ane rade tunge ki tsawa yinbe che o tunge koe tunge tamche yonsa ke tsawa te o nyamu ta nyamu ke sa kwa le che tila sebe so tab che ane yongu ya re se te sanza ko tunge ki gyu te te tuwa si ti samtang gora o tene kunchung yinde se gyu kunchung ten namba tamche to yanda yanda kebe che tunge ki rege drame dra mangbo rawa nyawa yeda tandola soba te tunge mangbo te zo kanga ane te da namba tamche to koke kebe che te yi ora tege o te kunchung wa yinde se ten namba tamche to yanda yanda kebe che tunge ki rege dra Rabbi in this, Rabbi Kyoto, which was Rabbi, let the Bachus, Rabbi Kiva in this, to make Rabbi Kiva in this,
No.
they should drive to kitchen, to make double condition. Sibe Sebachus on the Kenja number the schedule, Sibe Sebachus, Kaba Seba, the Kuba Lemba says, or this. Ela certain bege, chigala molia, certain bege, kenshi gege, seba de sigora, timiki carne su, and it's kenji number shetu tishegi wada, Yamoto, the shegi homada, teach you some shop, the world matusenbre. Sibe seba chosen, kenji number yende, rade to make it henchi chicken becher, rade to make it walako, henchi chicken, Kiolanga Mutilico. Go chamber care chamber in the future. Oh, this is.
So then turning to the aspect of origination, here the truth of origination is identified as contaminated karma and craving. And so contaminated is referring to being afflicted, being driven by our afflictive emotions, in turn driven by that apprehension of an I or grasping at an I. So in terms of like Arya beings, superior beings who are accumulating, they don't have contaminated karma because they don't have that affliction, they don't have the grasping at an I. But still, anything that has arisen from that apprehension of an I, and then our attachment or our aversion, anything, even virtuous karmas, are still a cause of taking rebirth within samsara. So contaminated here is referring to being driven by our afflictions, and in particular, that apprehension or grasping at an I. And so contaminated karma and craving have the aspect of the cause because they are the root of one's own resultant suffering. So this is referring to the fact that our contaminated karma, as well as craving, and here it will be explained below, but craving is referring in particular to the 9th link of the 12 links of dependent origination, which acts particularly as a condition that fosters or helps sort of nourish karmic imprints that lead us into a future rebirth. So here, this is first the cause. Contaminated karma and craving are the cause because they are the root of one's own resultant suffering. This is the cause of all of our suffering. It all comes from contaminated karma driven by our afflictions and the grasping at an I. And it is as well the origination of all suffering, this being the second aspect, because they are generated in all their aspects again and again. It is our contaminated karma and afflictions and craving as well that gives rise to all of the various types of suffering that we experience, all of the types of suffering that are within the 6 realms. All of those come from this contaminated karma and craving. And so this acts as they are strongly arising, the third aspect, because they are generated forcefully. When we have this, we continue forcefully to experience suffering. And finally, craving for existence has the aspect of condition because it is the cooperative condition of one's own resultant suffering. So here, this is not referring to contaminated karma and the afflictions, but in particular to craving. This, so we have the links in the 12 links of dependent origination, sometimes variously translated, but there is grasping and then craving, or attachment and craving. And craving, particularly at the time of death, acts as a condition for our taking future rebirths. In particular, if we have some sort of craving for a body or possessions or existence in general, this acts as a condition which actually helps us to take rebirth. So in terms of this fourth aspect, condition, it is referring specifically to craving, as in the 9th link in the 12 links of dependent origination.
Oh yeah. Don't go back number to them, go back number to that. Oh, this one. Oh yeah. Nimbe top this, Nimbo Tameba, Tobe, and a lamb combat of Jesse or Tangzingi Nimbo, Tunegi Ju, Zawa, Tangzingi Nimbo, Tamito Veshiro combat of J, Tungete Sebe, Jawadi Churches, Tameba Musum to go, Tambuteba, and then Tamisamutan shit, Tenayani and the Communist Musum to go, or Tetabi, Tungimusum, Tameba Musum to talk by. Tangzingi Nyembo, Tamito Beshiro Combe Tunge Tese Tawache. Assembly, Nemo says on a Tunge Juices, Tunge Juices, Tamahobane, go to Navachagora. Or in the Tunge Tese Tawache, Assembly, Angar, Nemo Chata, Tangziki or Tatanda, Nemo Chata, Tanzila Sovakia, Navachare. Tunge Ju. Chara. To get this at the Tawa Churches, Tango Denti Churches, Tawa de Churches, Tichibode, Nemo Pang de Pangba de Churches. Go back number in days, Kari Gogers and that to get the Pangitua, to get the Gobada, to me or Rankin Mendube, to get the Go the Mabachara. Go back number 80, to me Pangbe Tawa in bases, to me Pangsara, Mount Banda, to me Mara. She number in days, and she was to make it do Kunjun Yomo de Shiva, Pansade. She number in day, Yomo Pambeta in Bese. To make it do Kunjun and then Yomoba, Tanzida, Chagala, so when Yomo Pambe, Tawa in Bese. That number in days, Pembada, David Taba in Bese. Tandako Yichimba, that the Temboche Dengero. Oh, today so that called Janumba Sigua. Janumba number the Pembada de Tarwa in Beshe. Pembata, Pusu Pembata, Tanda Deva, Pembas the New Good Pembati. There was a Tanda Deva. That Tanda Kadu Inako, Jura Mavich against the Pende, Pembata de Tarwa in Beshe Sigua. No. When Junior number in this, Nye Jung said, Neba said, Tanda Nil Juguva. Teso Mabala Neba said, Nebar do Sura. Jura Mabala Neba Siciliora, never less. Or the Neban Joya number in this, Jura Meba. Tarba Lenji Topsas, Nemo Combat of the Sass, then Juria Yomare, Yanga your Mare Sigora. Or the Neban Joya number in the Lara Mendoga, Bangsara the young Yasu to me the Nemo to the care, maybe Pambata Sesa, Lar Mendoga. She punks at the Tayanga, punks at the two young mother, 10 pamper, you remember see pamper acid bar. Oh, Tituna.
No. So then turning next to the aspects of cessation. So here, this is referring to the freedom that is the elimination of the basis of suffering by force of the antidote. So here, the antidote being our understanding, a direct realization of selflessness. And that comes from first hearing about it, thinking about it, and then we meditate. And after some time, we're able to have a direct realization. And that direct realization acts as an antidote that creates this state of freedom, a freedom that is the elimination of the basis of suffering. And And so this is what is being referred to in terms of cessation. And so that freedom, that cessation of the basis of suffering by the force of the antidote has the aspect of cessation, because it is a freedom that has abandoned suffering. So this freedom, this separation from any kind of suffering has the aspect of being cessation, because one has abandoned all suffering. All unwanted suffering is eliminated through the force of the antidote. And it is peace, because it is a freedom that has abandoned defilements. So all of our afflictions are pacified, that fundamental apprehension of an I, or grasping at a self, and all of the afflictions that come out of that have been pacified, are no longer going to arise. So then the third aspect is here listed as sublimity, because it is a liberation that is beneficial and pleasurable. So here, this could have a sense of like satiation or satisfaction, beneficial referring to the sort of ultimate long-term in the future, and then the aspect of sort of pleasure as being always happiness, this freedom from those sufferings or from the cause of the sufferings has that aspect. And then finally, it has the aspect of definite emergence, because it is a dharmic liberation that is irreversible. So this is something that is unwavering or unchanging. The sense of definite emergence gets at the fact that it is a cessation, a freedom, an elimination of suffering that is such that it can never arise again. There's no way for our afflictions or resulting suffering to come back.
Oh yeah, that lamje number dira. Da me ba ngusum do to be shirap shuje sigwa. Da me ba ngusum to be shirap. Da me la thoba che, samba che. Ani yani yandu kondu ngusum do to be shirap shuje sigwa. Lamje number inde sube. Tharba joji gilami beshe. Anda ngazo thome mari bada teni chagda jikku nelane dwa re to the course te wara. Da tel harbe lam res tela ya ma khorche tela ya thare lam res gora. Chita lam se te lamgal dosa neshe lamle lam sigora. Dosden dosa lam dire tele chene ba yele gora. O tele tharbal joji lam. Da me ba ngusum do to beshira choje lam je namba yende tharbal joji lam ye beshe. Da khoa ko ne dwa re to ba khorche dosa lam ga ti mare tele shendo tungete doari du tungete le tharbe lamlia trojege lami beshe seba thaba troje lami beshe rebe namba inde ta meba musum to beshe bati rebe namba rebe na digmare te ta ba yore sete ko troje lamle riki mare se ora da da rebe namba re se ora rebe namba inde nyomo ge ngone se beshe Tunga yonsa jute nyamo re tela mo so nebe nyamo chebe sesora. Jube namba inde semje nelo tarto ba ngusum do togbe sheba inde sheta. Jube namba so semje nelo ngusum do togbe kones. Da semda chetambe karina nelo ngusum semje chinji malo jube sesora. Chagana so what is a never says a co simply Yanda. Musum to talk sim Chinji Malo, but to that and then the Chagana Shahad Machine tell it Tagwas to see the order. Oh, Jube number in the Sim Genelo Tag. Oh, that never Jimbe number in this and Jin never Jimbe number in the sugar decision, never Jimbe number in the Tungelar mendo be chujen do chebe nimbo yimbe chere. Tunge yangja yongye meba chipang chadu tendo pangba. Nebar do jimba san yuwa mebe suji eni meba songe lamde resi gora. Nijin seri. Nebar jimbe namba yinde tungelar mendo be chujen do chebe nimbo yimbe chere. Oh, teach so, teach you na.
No. So here then, turning to the aspects of the path. And so all of these again are sort of set up like a syllogism. So the beginning is the wisdom directly realizing no self has these aspects. And so this wisdom, which directly realizes no self, is something that we again begin by hearing about it, thinking about it, repeatedly meditating such that we are eventually able to have a direct realization. And it is this that acts as an antidote, it acts as a path, the first of these aspects, because it is a path that leads to liberation. Now, most of us are on this sort of path wherein we have since beginningless time, this fundamental ignorance, which leads us to then have attachment and aversion and so forth, and create actions that are leading us to continue to cycle within samsara. So when we talk about a path, it's like, it's what leads us somewhere. Like if we're going to Bodh Gaya or whatever, it's the path that will take us to a particular location. And so the 6 types of cyclical beings, those of us still in cyclic existence, we are leading ourselves continuing to go in samsara. But this path, referring to this wisdom directly realizing selflessness, is a path that leads to liberation. It leads us to a place or to a freedom from the kind of suffering that we are in. So it acts in that way as a path. And it additionally has the aspect of reasonableness because it acts as a direct antidote to defilement. So a direct realization of selflessness is it's reasonable because it is actually the antidote to this fundamental ignorance. If we were to say assert that our grasping at things as being permanent or having a self were reasonable, that's not reasonable or suitable. Those are not in accordance with reality. However, this direct realization of selflessness has this aspect of reasonableness in that it acts as a direct antidote to that fundamental ignorance. And it is, or it has the aspect of accomplishment because it is the gnosis that perceptually cognizes the ultimate actuality of mind. So it is, again, reasonableness because it is the direct antidote to our ignorance, and it is accomplishment because it is that which allows this gnosis or wisdom, which cognizes the actuality of mind, of all phenomena. This is the kind of achievement or accomplishment that comes out of that. And then finally, it has the aspect of definite removal because it is a dharmic antidote that cannot revert to suffering. So once one has cultivated wisdom in this way, it is such that it can absolutely completely eliminate suffering in a way that we will never again revert to that.
Oh yeah, don't do it. Oh, to go in the number, yes, shown some social chair, son last, to get them about the computer betting number, Kebude, and then number Sawagi shown to the loss of the from Shachara, teaching medal, teaching medal, Tongele, Tamis, Telegami vessel meda, Nivete, Kimacha, Tongi, Tami, Singulaba, Miss. Number social templates, our social Kagasin, Songsha, to get them with the money. To bring you number J, shown with some social sugar soon last. Golam, you number J, shown with some social Chena, Josana, Mercy. Golam, you didn't go by number 10, this year, and then go by your canon, but it's number 12, shown the social Chena chair or the essence. In a deal, lost a shame and do say. Josana Mages, Lovel Hall, number Delbeca, so go back number down, number no so soon best. Goblin and go, but they was so your Lambina, Lambding was from the Shanda, Gaga, Condival, Corner, did it, lost so much over the essay, oh, number you was so soon bad. Number Lama, Lama took Konevala Kone, no Susara Masumbar shadows.
No. So here then, the 8 aspects of suffering and origination are taught by individual divisions in the text of the Pramanavarttika. So here, when it comes to teaching these various aspects of the truth of suffering and the truth of origin, the truth of suffering being impermanent, suffering, void, and selfless, and origin being the cause, the origin of all, strong arising, and condition, those are actually explicitly taught within the divisions of the text. But if one wants to make individual divisions of the 8 aspects of cessation and path, it appears that one can do so. But Acharya Devendra Buddhi, who is a commentator on this text, explains that the aspect of cessation and the aspect of the path are taught directly. So the first aspect of each of those, while the remaining 6 aspects of cessation and path are not directly and clearly taught, but can be understood as intended. So when it comes to the aspects of cessation and path, the first aspect alone is taught explicitly, but one can understand the others like peace and sublimity and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Donna said, Donna told the Jupe, Yala, called Jupe, some years. Namjetan Debe Kasa, Samutane, called Jupe, Jukara, Dobe, Jukara, Tisamutane, Sambura, called Jupe, Yala, called Jupe, Tokten Jupe, Yala, called Dobe, called Judo, called Jubana. Khoa kadis kurgi ware, khoa dogdu kadis dogba chegures, wara jubatan dog. Jubdo jitsu samnes, khoa tada ki yi jungdes, oh, teni khoa ge tunge ki yi jungde. Tanda bado ngajo khoya ne lulonjo la sobon shenji chade yora. Ta tili ya o te tentu dewa si mare sam yi jungde, neban jungde, min jungde sami kensu wara. Yi jungde, Tarva Denge Lokebe, Tabsheba Nese, Tarva Denge Loke, Tabdi, Namde Deka Susumba, Shunde Michodo, Yushi to Navese, Namde Shunde, or Chodo Yushi, Shasandura, Navese, Shundela Tosam Chebe, Shini Dase, Samanamde Shundela Tosam Chenge, Kasa Sosandura. Senita, Kachita Bashido, Masonwase, or Kachilo Patene, Medaba res Vishandaji Medaba in Besson, Tunga res Vishandaji and Tendeba Masamacha, Medaba to the Sosoto Samatan, Soso Keji Duashi, Tunga to the Soso Tunga Chisane, Soso Lolia, Soso Teta Meda Tunga Dami to the Soso Torso, Congo de Esongiara, Kachita Bashido Mason. Shambata Ninji Sesona, Shandaji Shigation, Sosolia, Mandela, Soso Simbi, Ninji Wong Duas, Shambe Wong Duras, Amen Wong Duras, Soso Simbi Tito Shuniba, Namiso, Temataya, so budget, Chibutaya to the Machisondora. Oh, Shundela, Shundini Chodo, Yushishan, Nave, Shundela Tosam Jibe, Shenida, Kachita, Bashido, Masoan. Koachita Chidaki Nimi Lebar Samne, Tela, Koachi Tungeta, Dwari do Sosos Tungelia, Lebar Samne, Tela Yi Jun Chikitas, Tela Yi Jun Kekure, Yi Shambalone, Kyoakele, Yi Jun Chikita, Tarba, Tenigi Lo Chikichas, Tibata Chisona,
No.
or Tibata.
So here then it's continues saying, I will explain in brief the method whereby the intelligent contemplate the details of engaging samsara and the way of reversing engagement with samsara. So here this he's teaching in brief this method, the ways in which we are cycling in samsara. How is it that we continue to be in this kind of situation, and what is the way in which one is able to reverse that? And so he's saying that he's going to explain in brief this method whereby the intelligent contemplate these details and thereby renounce all of samsara and generate a mind intent on liberation. So most of us are still very much attached to, we have a clinging or craving for our body and our possessions and our life and so forth. And in order to eliminate that, we need to generate renunciation and a mind intent on liberation by really contemplating how samsara works and how we get out of that. And this text appears to be uniquely important. And those scholars who think about studying this text should not direct their minds only to externals, but should contemplate well the general and particular advantages of samsara. And this is really something that we need to do in relation to ourselves. If we're just thinking about external things, other things like, oh, that over there is impermanent and this is suffering over there, we don't see how this actually applies to ourselves, then we're not going to generate renunciation or a mind intent on liberation. So we really need to not be like pointing out at external things and thinking about this as like something that only applies to things out there. It's really about recognizing this in relation to ourselves, that we ourselves are impermanent and these aggregates are in the nature of suffering and so forth. And this is what we need to do in order to really elicit a kind of change within our mind. Whether we are meditating on compassion or selflessness, it's really important that we are doing so in a way that that becomes the nature of our mind. It's not sort of like we're watching a movie out there just taking in information, but rather our meditations should be such that we really generate that within our mind. We generate the nature of compassion, or we generate the nature of selflessness in our mind. So if we genuinely contemplate suffering and the way in which we engage in samsara in relation to ourselves, then that's how we give rise to this sense of revulsion or disillusionment within with samsara, and there will arise to an equal degree this mind intent on liberation.
Oh yeah. Oh, dear. That is that keep an ass on the oh, Koya, you met the koala, you want to do that. Tarba, Tom, you keep an ass on your oh, Jenny. The other keep an ass, how about Sutum Gilabe, Shirs on Love Sutum Kill Silung, Tambala Sobatejo, Sutum Gilaba, the Shirs on the Abuja songs in Gara. Fakbasem Gilaba, Shizam Lodan Sambarella, Nende Chene. Lava Simji Lava sitting in general, Midava Samata, Nitigana Simja, Shabache, Midava Sam Sarashe, Nitigana Simjo. Yata Nashi, Tumia Samata, Prepare Samata, Teniating Tumia Resa Simjo, Jogum decision, what I Sheba Chene, Simlia Chargira, Yabu Charsona, and it to that it is something on Jogum Chagresura. Joba throw shed, things to Chigara. Oh, this Nede, Lagwas Sembi Labe, Laba Chisam, Lodan Sambarilla, Nede Chenese, Namsa Mata things with the Chandeka. Nana Diga John Kaseyono, Sosulog Kaze, but the net to the Telene Yansabas, Yantiga Nesu, Yanti 7 million, Samuta Nesu Sugara. Oh, Nede. You did share Kasaki Damita, Ting Jilabashe, Shooting Jilabashe, Shira Jilabatelia, Liu Dene Shebe, Namdi Liu Ibane Shebe, Kasaki Damita, no one Shebe, Shigi Dami Lever, Yana Panda comes from Gudwa. Oh, yeah.
So then when those attitudes have arisen, when one has given rise to a kind of renunciation of samsara and a mind intent on liberation, then they are taken as the basis of the training in higher morality. So if we have this kind of a renunciation, we will give rise to a desire to train in ethical conduct. And ethical conduct, as the Buddha has explained, is the foundation of our training. And so taking that as a kind of basis or foundation, it continues saying, also having striven in the higher mental training as much as is suitable to one's mind, one should sorry, so I'm just going to go with that part. So this refers to then the higher mental training is the training in meditative stabilization. So here, this is something where we think about something. We do a kind of contemplative meditation or analytical meditation, and then place our minds on that object. So whether you're thinking about impermanence or suffering, when you come to some kind of a conclusion or a decisive understanding, you then place your mind on that object single-pointedly. So as it says here, one should do this as is suitable to one's mind. When we are engaging in meditation, we should do some kind of analytical meditation and then placement meditation for some time in accordance with one's ability. And then it continues with the training in wisdom by saying, and one should establish through reasoning the no self of persons explained in this chapter and the no self of dharmas explained below, and then meditate on it. So here again, this is encapsulating the three trainings, but this is something that one needs to do in accordance with one's own mental capacity.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's the oh, the Mida Dungi, Tong Damela Sobaka, Koe, Kenda, oh, Tendus Samutan, Yanti Semsha, Yanchi, Tigan Semsha, Namsanti, Combatala, Tokola Cherry, Shuka, Shilichi, Mena, Chisan Combat, some Jesem became the Copajas and Never said Duyora, Shitsuyora, Dabada Dunga, Koe, Samuta, and the Samuta. Namsanko Togo Humanity, she took your never Shabushagora, Pasha Shagora, Yana Yandu Samutana, send it in the Pasha, Liberty, Tarve Shitu Basiba, Tarve Sabin Shagora, or Tisam Gurmado, she combo in the K, Namsak Togo Maso Samsan, Shayake Mara, Kazasam Tuna, Tesam Yiko, Shitu the Rangatil, send it in the Pasha Shagora.
So whether we are contemplating thinking about the aspects of suffering, like thinking about impermanence and suffering, emptiness, selflessness, and so forth, we should contemplate or thinking about the kind of defects of samsara and our cycling within it. As much as we are able to, we should think about those things and then place the mind in a kind of placement meditation. And in this way, balance or use an analytical kind of meditation with this placement meditation. As much as we are able to do this, we are laying down imprints on the mind. We are actually placing the seeds for liberation by doing this. And so this is not something where we should expect to sit down in a meditation session and immediately be able to give rise to realizations, but rather we should recognize the benefit that comes from placing these kinds of imprints within our mind such that the strength of them gets more and more. And so we are, by this kind of practice, placing the seeds of liberation in our mind, and we shouldn't have an expectation of immediate kinds of results. It can take many eons, but this is beneficial in and of itself.
Oh, the Indico Kasura. Chambata Niji Nanda, Koala never should be enjoying and Midaba combine and Tame combine and or take Anka Social, Jindanama, Yana Yando Come, Yana Yando. Which are mother Tapsi and Dake Yomara. Consider redoing on my Samanamika Sungudua. Consider redoing on my Sabel and the Hawassense. Ninji Chimbreke, Ninji come. Kona written by the Comni Yadora. Midaba Come in Midaba, Yan Midaba, any Yadra, Musum the Togra. Calling you in and Chambain and so in the Kona did a timber Samutan. Rita timber did come any idea of Mado. Shanda man said, Chichaka your mother. Is redoing on my Sabin and the power Shasuba. Kona going to tell the word. Namsan pays something like this. So I can be young, so I should be on taking Bella. Compared to water. Kanji redoing on my Sabin and the power says. So I lost a lot of that combat you not call a nest. Kaze Kundisha, but that's a Yamanashi. Raso Degama, Yamanashi Degama, Kokarina, simply to the virtual Paza to the Yaya do your resumura. Kanji return on my Sabin and the Pawasha. Savala Sosa, Savata, Nijoda, that Tomani, Tami Togola Soba, come just how much in the Sumura. So I was with the company on the Kalanes, session to take Maris. Not under the Tibet, Tilha, do something. Let's say your mother. Never say your mother. Because they combat this and because check on the computer paid to raise of the bar. Oh, teaches me.
No. So here, when it comes to our meditating on things like love and compassion, or thinking about the defects of samsara, or thinking about selflessness and so forth, this is something that we have to make repeated effort at. We think about these things, we contemplate them, and we lay down imprints. We lay down these kinds of seeds in order to habituate our mind and eventually be able to develop a direct realization. So here, there is a previous verse in this text, the Pramanavarttika, that is explaining that our minds, they come from a previous accustomation. So compassion and so forth arise through accustomation in the mind. They will naturally enter the mind and so forth. I'm not sure on the exact verse, but this is really getting at all of these come from previous homogenes or previous minds of a like type. So it's not as though we can just bypass the kind of repeated familiarization with compassion or with the defects of samsara, or thinking about impermanence and so forth. We develop the capacity, we develop the intensity of those through repeated familiarization, repeatedly creating those homogenes or those minds of a similar type. And then it is through that that we are able to make these part of the nature of our mind, or actually have a direct realization of those topics. So here, as has been explained earlier in this very text, it is how we generate compassion and so forth by creating those previous minds of a similar type, building that up, that we are able to do so. There's no way to just immediately have these things.
Oh, yeah. Oh, then there's some time, so Kaze Kombayana Telia, Kawa Kongo, Chesu Yanacho, Susa Kevala, Naki Kevala, Chesu Yanacha, oh, Metri, Suzuchina, Kamakashina, Titandalia, Koala Meba Jumada, Yata Mebada, Medabada, Tende Komtuso, Keva Sambuchon Sampe, Yabuchon Sam Susu Kevalia, Keva Toma Mevan, Tende Sanji Tambadaje. 다음에 받았는데 공에 터야 될 건거라 다른 렌지 고 교환 아마서는 배산이 터버라 데리야 된 타버다 탐제 좀 터야게 시초에 삼부지 거르더라 아 근데 시삼다야 그거가 무슨 삼로 소설 교화제부터 세수에나 저거라 가공구라 어깨가 삼수 배하고 소소사 와샤샤 투송 삼사 가공 아니 사이네니 공에 남사한테 공에 가베 또셔도네 준주시다 제가 개라 좋아하고서 가베도네 개바 상부인사 상무다 야구 소소 소소 개발이 제시해라 저거다 그냥 공부에 단다 시다야지 심마소 삼때데 상부 말아야지 로데라 거까지 공부할 삼이 야지 로데야로 제심되게 좀 소소 공부에 마도 공부야야 그런 도시하게 마도 티게요 마도 제소다 Kedere samutana sosu ke ola chesu na se kawa kompu kompe ke ba sambu sonso de sonso mese o tede sambora ya digere.
So again, through habituation, there is no kind of a limit to this. We can continue to, it is in the nature of our mind, to be able to continue to increase and develop those kinds of qualities within mind. And so this is something where we should rejoice at our own virtues, rejoice at the opportunity that we have to be laying down imprints of these kinds of understandings. So we have, since beginningless time in samsara, been taking rebirth, and we have an extremely fortunate situation to now have met with the teachings of the Buddha and actually have this opportunity to contemplate these various topics and lay down those kinds of imprints. And so we should make sure to take the time to really rejoice in the virtue that we are doing and recognize the great fortune and opportunity of this situation. So this is something where we need to have that kind of joy. Again, there is the fourth perfection of joyous effort, to be doing things with joyous effort is to have that sense of joy when you go into it. So if we are rejoicing in our own virtue, no matter how much we're just laying down imprints, then when we go down to the cushion the next day, say, we will be excited, happy to be able to have that opportunity to continue to improve our minds. So we shouldn't think like, oh, there's no way that this is going to improve. I don't really think that I'm doing this well. By repeatedly familiarizing the mind with these kinds of topics, we will continue to improve. We will continue to strengthen those imprints. And so we should really take the opportunity and make sure to rejoice in the virtue that and the opportunity that we have.
Oh yeah. 대단히 제나 세라. 되게 쳐봤지. 아니 추중 길라바 땡에진 길라바 라시르 길라바 송리아 바샤시 둠체니 안에도 콤바테들 세베나 송거라. 대단히 제나 땡조라 초섬 제바 전심보다 땡제시. 땡조리아 쳐봤지. 삼로다 땡제시아 된다 첨부 된다바레 송거라. 라게 생기된도 바샤 너가 첨부 샤게요라. 땡신세. 라게 땡조기 Tell a nimble by inversion. Tawajet and Jorvachu and Militobadelia, nimble went over race on the Ora, Pasasha and social communitalia, Yana Yandu Jibishi, Ukachora, Sudela, Beba, Nendendo Chayas, or Tendes and Neda Delia Beba, Teshambuch and the Chavades over. Teach an anim, social Tosam Jabba, and that's Shambuch. Tele Shendo. Niebada Kudita, Shirley Tosam Kosola Sobachero, then Nieba Toviana, Kudita, Keta Chimbo, Tende, Yosana, and it Tiba, Mabusa, the Esungura, Tidungi, Julia, one seniors, and it Tiba the Tom Suna Chimbizi, Samla Tondamago, Kona Julia, Media, second book, Tosam Baba Kaja. Lo Ranga, Mezzo Mambo, Tobata Samba Combasera, Sitan Samlo Tandaki, Dirty Sungora, Sambo Tandaki Nedati, Sitan Tosam Mezingi, Shingba, Shingatam, the Tangan, the Resident, there's the Keva members, Serena, no one do this. Lo Ranga, Lo Samlo Tandaki, Dodati Sungora, Dirty. Deba Chijun Dasa, Nelly Longola Soba, Coag, Dentus, Deba Chijun Da, Geshe Chijun Koala, Nebanjuni, Joashe Chijun Da, the Shingatam, the Tesam Chi, Machine Get the Kabachi, membership, Ina Sungora, Chimbaranga, Namda, Kevin Chunsa, Never, Guru or Tina. Tamnya data Shanda so similar singular Bengi Mares, Simbaranga, and Chitan Samutan, Guadu Mare, Benjoina da Carina, Chicken Consolation, Chizunda, Kua Chizunda, and the Simbat Ranga, the Kawaman Chagres, or Dure, Lamloy, Migban Bashido Mason Arse. Mijun shares on a Chanju Sim shares on a new shares on a Timbere Shada Migba Chamado, Social Law de Tikan Drag, Samomata in Asogara, Lamde Loy, Migba Social Law de Shademo Julia, Ceremon Julia, Tamimo, Togomo Julia, Midago Togo Julia, Tashisha, Timado, Demotange Sundre, or Titi, Migba Janjamado. Lotiti, social lotting, or the Toshi Machina Sogorda. Deo Tirida. Miba Bashido Soar, Loyang or Joala, and then to Bever Showers, or Tiba de Siguna.
No. So here then, if practitioners act thusly, as was explained above, taking these three trainings in ethics, meditative concentration, and wisdom, and act thusly, their study of and reflection upon the Shastras will be very meaningful, and they will seize the essential in the human existence that is the basis of leisure and opportunity. So right now, while we have this life, while we have this life with all of these the freedoms and endowments, the 8 freedoms and the 10 endowments, we have this chance to be able to set down these imprints, whether we're meditating on selflessness or compassion, generating renunciation. We have this chance to use our life, this life that we have now, and make it very meaningful by studying and reflecting and meditating on these teachings. So we have that opportunity, but if they think otherwise, so if someone is motivated instead, thinking that they should obtain possessions and respect and fame, and then their mind streams will be considerably impaired by their vices and the downfall of their vows. So if someone is still really under the control of the 8 worldly dharmas, thinking only about getting famous or wanting some kind of material gain, then everything that they're doing will be really impairing their mind and will lead to a kind of downfall, increase in non-virtuous actions. So when someone is motivated with that kind of wrong motivation, when they memorize, they cannot retain the words. When they reflect, they do not understand the meaning. And when they meditate, the objects do not arise in their mind streams. So it's sort of like we're just letting our minds go how it would normally go, even though we claim to have been striving to study and understand the Dharma. If someone like this, in fact, their minds, so their minds will not be different in any way than they ordinarily run with regard to the degree of their desire and the degree of their renunciation. It's in no way different than that of like an ordinary farmer. So if we allow our minds to just kind of keep going the way that they normally do, but we're pretending to study Dharma, or we're saying that we're studying Dharma, it's no different than, say, an ordinary farmer, or the way that our mind would ordinarily run. So when it comes to our meditation on these topics, it continues by saying that not simply making the path an object of their minds, they should strive earnestly to generate it as the nature of their minds. So we shouldn't be seeing things as like this external object out there that we're just learning about for the intellect's sake, to be able to identify it and see it as totally external. But when it comes to things like bodhicitta or compassion or selflessness, we're meditating to be able to really internalize that, to make it in the nature of their minds, not just like having some kind of objective information that one is learning.
Oh yeah. That talam ki meeting cho shenda ke se tarbe lam ki meeting cho chiribala so ba shenda ke talam to tabe de tame ko ba talam mare de tarba to be juri shenda de tabe chinji lo ge to shi to wo ne mo so ge se mo so ne lo ne ge go be ju sen so da se lo be se da so ji lang so be go be 주sen다 타르바다 탐제 캠바 뭐부 tuksuki rigwe 주베 추소는 워도 셰반주라 타르바 주베 rigwa 탐제 캠바 주베 rigwa 뭐부 tuksuki rigwe 주바도 원이 셰기 인송도와.
So then, having identified the 4 paths distortedly imputed as paths to liberation by others, which are the opposing factors to the actual path of liberation, then the Acharya, here referring to Dignaga in the commentary Dharmakirti, will explain below the reasons refuting them and the way of proving liberation and omniscience through objectively impelled reasoning. So having identified those that are the distorted paths, it's going to then prove below through this objective kind of reasoning those correct paths.
타르바다 탐제 캠바도 가가 뭐도 되는 거 투투 요소 거라 아니 야 가서라 뭐도 되는 것은 뭐고 거라게 바 또기 바 콩게 요다 퍼져서 삼타 통계지 거라 그러나 가시제 계시 조라ချင်း메다바 인데세 주진기 제바 이메치스라 주단진기 제바로서 나이 따로 샤샤 나이 따시제 계시 요래 메다바 인데 나다 나야다 제조 제베 치스라 I try to say, you think it's ever in this. Got that took away enough. And you come out there, see, don't shut on it, tongue cigarette. Okay, that's one answer. Then my Germany uncle Tata Maro said, you think it's ever, she said.
No.
You think it's ever in it, you think it's ever, she said, don't some to talk.
No.
You then do some tell it that any way that okay, you are changing my to your mother. Dinashing around the mission which at the Utango, Kalasa with a teacher, so which is a KG could so I said there with a mother. Ramajane, Nemato de Ramajane, some which at the Omara. So Tezuka move to see you went to this, never for Angitone, couldn't get to this, Musumla to do but.
No.
In the day, which Musumla to there. But Anna is a Tarbada, Tumile Taria Yoba. Shabbat saw to come the yard dry, but to the moment to see you went to this and you are or this one.
No. So here again, where it says in this last full sentence on 349 that the Acharya will explain below the reasons refuting those wrong paths and the way of proving liberation and omniscience through objectively impelled reasoning. So we are able to establish the existence of liberation and omniscience, as well as impermanence and selflessness and so forth, by what is translated here as objectively impelled reasoning. And here, this is really reasoning that ultimately comes back to a direct perception. So for example, you could say sound is impermanent, or it is momentary, changing moment to moment, because it is produced. It arises due to causes and conditions. And so if you were trying to prove this to someone, you could begin by saying like, well, the sound of a drum is produced, it comes about by causes and conditions because it arises when I hit the drum with the mallet. And so by establishing that someone can directly hear, can see that this sound only arises when you have a cause, when you hit that drum with a mallet. And thereby they can establish that this sound is something which is produced. And thereby using the syllogism, well, the sound of a drum is momentary, or it is impermanent in terms of being momentary because it arises from causes and conditions. One can establish this because it's, again, what is an objectively impelled reasoning. One can directly see these things, directly realize, such that the syllogism can be internalized. So here, when it comes to like looking at our body and our life, we know that we have to say eat and drink and we have to take care of ourselves. There's no way that we can just sort of be alive for as long as we want without having to rely upon causes and conditions. And so thereby we can recognize that we are impermanent and so forth. And so when it comes to establishing any of these topics, from the ability to achieve liberation, a cessation of sufferings, to selflessness, to compassion, these are things that can be established, or the ability to increase compassion infinitely. These are all things that can be established by what we call objectively impelled reasoning. So here then in this, in the teaching here, everything is established. Again, like we are looking at the reverse system whereby one proves that the Buddha is a valid being. So this is something that can be, again, established through objectively impelled reasoning. This teaching that is given by the Buddha is something that we investigate for ourselves and see the sort of process of causality we are able to establish. We aren't just quoting scripture to say, well, the Buddha said it was like this, but rather by investigating these Four Noble Truths as taught by the Buddha, we can see that what he has taught in terms of the way in which one engages in samsara and the way in which one reverses that is actually something that is true. And this is, again, something that goes back to objectively impelled reasoning, when we are able to establish with a reason that actually meets with a direct perception eventually. And so thinking about these things, these are all the forward system as well as the reverse system here, which we have arrived at, are able to prove that the Buddha is a valid being or an authentic being based upon using syllogisms that are objectively impelled, that we can understand for ourselves without quoting scripture or relying upon scripture.
Oh yeah, that is just
No. So
Yes.
the main time is gone. So if we want to turn to a question and answer then. If there are questions.
Now you. Okay. Yes. Now, thank you, Geshe Thabkhe and Katrina. We're opening it up for questions now, beginning with the questions from Abbey monastics and then going to questions online.
I have one question. I was wondering if Geshe could elaborate on the difference between the third and fourth aspect of the truth of suffering. So this is on page 345. So looking at void and without self. I'm not so clear what the difference is between these two.
Yes. 아니 genla ta duktengi kapsu namba sumba dan shiba ki keba kareres yangyar sungrona ta tongba namba sumba dan shiba ki keba kareres. No.
Kashe Jagane Rigma to the Pungutu Mizare, Titina Podio Mareko Togore, Sechi, Shenda, Tramshita, Geo, that is Lusang Mashibure, Sechi Ora, or take as a shake. You tell it to us, Pungutin Mizan Yamina, Kanga Dada Chibare, when it Pungule also, Sane Das and get a Kashe Da, some Kashe Da, Mizawa Tendeji or Marese. Pungule ten shendo, Sane da shendo yo mare songora. Pungule Mombo da seven nation, Kawa da Pumba nation, Peso Suzuche, Kagachen yo mare songora. Tela Tomba Sigdoa. Pungule, Pungu Mizawa Yena, Pungule ten shembe, and it's Sama Yenge Dashi, Kiabodan, Barmanda, Tendeta, and it's over Yenge Da Tende, Pungule ten shendo bay. No.
So beginning then with, so again, the third and fourth aspects are that suffering is empty and without self. And so here, this is indicating that this suffering, these contaminated aggregates are empty of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And in the third aspect, this is grasping at a self that is somehow a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that is somehow separate from the aggregates, like a separate, if we were to go through all of the 5 aggregates, not that you couldn't point to anything within them, but it's rather something that's sort of like controlling the aggregates apart, aside from it. And this actually is very clearly explained in the 400 verses by Aryadeva. But it's some sort of, there are some schools, for example, that non-Buddhist schools that think that there is like, our body is unclean, it's kind of impure, but there is a self that is somehow pure, controlling or having power over those unclean aggregates. So you could kind of think about it in the way that like there's a caste system in India and they sort of look down on certain castes, but someone that's like a king or a Brahmin is like this pure or clean. So your aggregates would be like the sort of dirty or impure, and there's some kind of clean or pure self that is somehow separate. And in this kind of case, there's a separate, objectively separate self, the way that they talk about like blue and yellow are different things, or a pot and a pillar. Your aggregates and the self would be a totally separate kind of a thing.
Oh yeah. Todako range to be pumbu sidiku sobudan semni dira. Sobudan semni bu pumbu deda ne da sengje ko dede sinni yo mare so ge ora. Pumbu sobudan semle dan sembe be sobudan semne se lo so da yo mare so ge ora. Dede ni yo se sobudan semle sembe haje ni yo mare tamba se de.
No.
Da ne ba Sajay Yaniki Pumbuche, Tame by the Rana Tagan Woman. So that same Koran to your tag and all to your Chigma Resumura. So the Sogi Pumbuchoa, Dushi to the Tag and Home Mares, Koran da Mares, da the Chigma Resugura. And then Ranget to be the Pumbuna with the resident Ranget to be the Mare Chicks and your Mare. And Pumbula to ancient to Ranget to be Sayita, Bekagacha in the day your Mare. The Mazan Pumbulia, and get to be say, you die your marriage, chicken your marriage, Pekagas and Jason your marriage, Kushani the Kugdoa.
No, yes. So then there's no sort of separate self that is a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that is somehow separate apart from the aggregates. So this is what is being referred to with the third aspect of void or empty. But there's also not a self-sufficient, substantially existent self within the aggregates or within our mind and body. So it's not as though we can point to something within the aggregates or mental consciousness that has the nature of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. If you are looking for something within the aggregates that is single, unitary with those aggregates, you can't find such a self. So there is in the third aspect this idea that there's some sort of objectively separate, self-sufficient, substantially existent self that is somehow controlling the aggregates. And the third idea, or fourth, would be that there's not a self that exists within the nature of those aggregates as somehow a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that is of the mind and body. Does that clarify? Oh, yeah, again.
Well, thank you.
Number Sanje, but the Chiribasina, Tachi, Rawash, and Gitayo, Tagba Yinge, Chibuchame Yinge, Ranga Tuba Yinge, Tayo, Resivera, Nambagadio, Mares, Dameba, Tachi Rawash, and Gitameba, Ranga to be say, Gitameba Cobra.
No.
And that they told that Tamini said, Tamide, Pumbu Mabu de Tag and Woma Tuba, Pumbu de Tag and Woma Imba,
No. So then in terms of the kind of view of such a self, I mean, generally, conventionally speaking, there is a self, but some Buddhist, non-Buddhist schools assert that there is some kind of permanent, unitary, independent sort of a self. So there is no such self that exists like that. And neither is there a self-sufficient, substantially existent kind of a self. And that is not, as it is explained in this fourth aspect, it doesn't exist or isn't established as in the nature of those aggregates. It's not like there's somehow the nature of a self within those aggregates.
Oh yeah, then do matter, Geshe. Oh, that go don't me ni na ne da me pare. Kumbu ngabo de da go mo me pare sigwa. The trubja mo ne de kare sa anje to be say da me pare trubja de do.
No.
Chanda kumbu ne chole rangya to be say da me de rangya to be say da de kumbu da chik do me kumbu da ngo ta de do me be se se re do kyusen ni de ku do ton ta me ni de.
So we can actually see these two final aspects as being like reasons that are proving the thesis that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So we can say the subject, these contaminated aggregates, don't have or aren't a self-sufficient, substantially existent self because there is no objectively separate self. There's nothing that's different from the nature of the aggregates, nor is there something that is exactly the same as in the nature of the aggregates. And so those two are really reasons that are proving the thesis of there not being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self.
Oh yeah, that is it matter. Oh, Joshua done way.
Yeah, so I think that will do it for that question. Are there more questions from the Abbey?
Yes, I have a question from last night. It was said that the 12 links fit into either suffering or causes of suffering. Where and how does the third link, consciousness, fit into that?
아니, 치워디 계산에레스 다 yenla tendril yenla chunibe kapsu 다 디강가 dukten yena kunjung demba yingorwa 디강가 디니라 공수 두기로와 이네 yenla sumbadi namchegi yenla di dukten yena kunjung gidemba yena.
Ne? The best is not to get them back in.
아니 텐들 yenla chunigi kapsu di yenla sumpa namshe rawa
No, to me, my super namshi, yeah.
namshe di dukten rebe yanga kunjungi demba rebe.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Tommy Marie Bakunela, even do Gigi Lessa, Leg, Pacha Shasa Giorva,
No.
Pacha Shasa Delia, Kunjun Deba Pseudo, Leg, Pacha Yatang, Simple Sigara, Subanamshi. Oh, this the Kunjun Debara.
No.
Diana Tanzania, Tommy Marie Bakunela, even do Gigi Lessa, Subanamshi, the Kialan Baker, Ginamshi Lessa, each enaco. Tunge temba yenge ta di shegora sumba namshi shegora
No.
kudu gi namshi dan jedu gi namshi singi shegora sumba namshi dela kudu se kome marbe kunela niban duji lesa lege nuba de nyaje denge telia ane kudu gi namshi ra tene ko kewala sone kewala ma ta namshi shora tela jedu gi namshi shegora.
So here then regarding the third of the 12 links of dependent origination consciousness. So we have, this can actually be divided into causal consciousness and resultant consciousness, thus going into both the truth of suffering and the truth of origination. So we have, again, with the first link, this ignorance that we've had since beginningless time that leads one to accumulate karmic formations, and those imprints are then laid down on the consciousness. And at the time of laying down imprints on the consciousness, the sort of consciousness that is holding those imprints, we would say, is part of the truth of the origin of suffering. It's part of those imprints are going to be causes of future suffering. And then there is the kind of resultant consciousness, particularly the sort of consciousness that when we first take rebirth, that is the result of previous karmas. And so that would be included within the truth of suffering. Those sorts of resultant consciousnesses are then going to be considered part of the truth of suffering, whereas consciousness at the time when imprints are being laid down would be considered part of this causal consciousness, is part of the truth of the origin of suffering.
Sumba namshese legi pasha zindenge derwa. Dine jeba che, kube lemba che, chuba sibe leje tele, gyui tende tu sigidwa, kunju tembe tandora. Gyui chanera. Ta dine shiba chujiba kyawa sagura, chujiba kyawa che, shiba mingsu che, ngaba keche che, chuba rekwa che, tumba tsawa che, Chuchiba Kashichi repeated the truth the debut and disigua, to meet and better on Wachina. Tweet and the truth the Kujutambacha, debut and the truth to meet and Basha, China Yesha to Shura.
So here then, when it comes to the 12 links of dependent origination, we have then those that are considered to be sort of the causes in terms of our beginningless ignorance, and then karmic formations, as well as consciousness at the time when those imprints are laid down. And then you have the kind of clinging, the 8th link, and craving, the 9th link, as well as the 10th, which is, those are all causal sorts of links of dependent origination, and thereby are included within the truth of the origin of suffering, whereas the link of birth and aging and death, as well as the sort of resultant consciousness, our name and form, the sense bases, contact and feeling, are all part of the resultant suffering, so therefore are included within the truth of suffering.
Order. Chitako to get them but on Kunju Dembasna called Gawake, Gagamidua. Penanganzo, and then Mili should be me sem Jiwana, me sem de Kawangama is Pambasondako to get them by the Devara. That date and less as the Kawachima Drumsirian, less as a Paksasha Nevashagiora. This is the Kawachimage. No.
So we can think about it kind of simply of like, we have this consciousness, we have right now a human life and this human consciousness, and this is something that came about due to previous karma. So thereby it's the truth of suffering. It's that kind of resultant result of those previous causes. But we also have, at the time when we are laying down imprints of karmas on that consciousness, that would be considered to be part of the truth of the origin of suffering. Those are going to act as causes that ripen in the future. So there's a sort of a causal dimension, and then the effect or resultant kind of consciousness.
Oh yeah, I do matter to me.
So are there other questions then from the Abbey?
No, there doesn't seem to be any other questions from the Abbey, but there is one from online, which I can read out to. You'll find it in the answered box.
Yeah.
It is said that the contaminated karma and afflictions lead to our grasping at autonomous substantial self. I assume that this grasping is the function of the omnipresent mental factor of discrimination. What is the mechanism by which our past karma and afflictions act upon this mental factor of discrimination to mislead it into grasping? Thank you.
아니 디 튜어 디테스 코 카포로와 아니
Yeah.
거기 삼수라 nganso sakchegi le dan nyumong la tene di rangya tupe zeyugi daktu zingyorwa ine ngone chena dila doktorwa nganso le dan nyumong di yu marwa nganso rangya tupa zeyugi zimba di thangbo jungirwa
Good.
no 아니 디 톡마 메파네로와 디 유 믹세기 유 무즈냐 요마르와 디 톡마 메파네 마리파 nganzindi 유 믹세 무즈냐 요마르와
Toma mariba, toma mebane yorwa.
no 요레
Mene?
코랑기 삼수랑 nganso di semlang semjung 요라와 아니 semjung di 두셰기 삼중 라 테네 ngarjin di kegires samgidu
Oh.
yene ngone chena nganso di ngula maripa yore dagjin yore roa
Good.
lo so I'm just having a little bit of trouble with this question because it's actually the case that this grasping at an autonomous substantial self precedes our karma and afflictions. So this, when we speak of ignorance or grasping at an I as being beginningless, this is really something that is beginningless. There's no cause that you can point to that leads to this. So I'm not sure if we can speak about it being I could ask whether it's a mental factor or a mind, but really the order of causation is not correct here.
Oh, me, she labda.
No.
Oh, Beji called this segment. Tome Maribara, Tome Maribade Tango Yungura.
No.
In a ding in the Yaniban Duji let a ding in a leshada yora.
No.
Tome Mar the Timu do Kage membership chain, Tini go Sabatune, Yomaria. Le Karisagin, Tome Mariba Digi Koran, Niban Duji Le Karisan, Tisagra. Tome Mariba Mondo Yan Le Yor, Wakiwa Yorma. The Kote Kangali Tiki Yomar, Chita Tende Yana Chuni, Tome Mariba Mondo, Kiwa Yore, Gawa Yore, Shiva Yore, Nawa Yore, Kanga Yora. This segment, Tome Mariba in Tome Mariba Mondo, any Carriores and that Timondo Shenda Yoshor, and Niba Dujigle, Yenico, Tome Mariba Yungi, Kansa di Kiwa Pangora, Niba Dujamondo Samsara. Kote Yomar, Kurim Chita never Yomarata. Kiwachi Pay, Tome Maribukuna, even Duji Lesa, Sumbanam Sijani, Dus Kialan Shidu Dus Segura.
No.
Matu Italia, and Kiwashanda Yorwa.
No.
Get Tamburi, Tingi, Shenda Kan Yomar, Setilisha Yomar Nambolia. Zambulin de Soya de Tambudelia, Tambutambi. This is my door, talk about it.
Yeah, Chishana di Reshata. No. My apologies for my inabilities as a translator to get this across correct, perhaps. But here, if we're thinking about like what came first, if we are trying to point to within the 12 links of dependent origination, the first cause, and you say, well, ignorance comes first. Well, ignorance has to propel somebody to take another rebirth, and so it gets kind of into a chicken and egg situation of, well, what came before birth and aging, and then ignorance, or did ignorance precede that? And so there's a way in which we can't really point to which came first. This is constantly happening in a cycle where we have this ignorance, and then we create karma, and then those karmas ripen, and we continue to have this ignorance. And so perhaps that is what this question is trying to get at. It may be my poor translation, but the sort of causality and the way in which this cycle happens, we point to, okay, well, ignorance is first, but really this is something that is continually revolving and continually cycling. So here, when we look at the 12 links of dependent origination, they're actually sort of going over 3 lives. If we think about the kind of life that we have right now, and the consciousness and name and form and so forth, and then we are creating, and that came as a result of ignorance and karma in the past, and we are continuing to create the sort of causes for that to come about in the future through clinging and craving, as well as existence, and then birth into a new life. So it's actually these although we explain them in kind of an order, really they're happening in these overlapping kind of ways in which you actually would map them out over at least 3 lives.
Oh yeah, that
No. So that will do it for today, as our time is up. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Geshe Thabkhe, for such a wonderful teaching tonight. And also thank you to Katrina for her translation. And so now we will go to our dedication prayers.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Losong's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzing Gyatso Chenrezig, May you stay until samsara ends.
Okay, thank you all. See you tomorrow.